So let me ask you, where have you seen God's creative wonder in nature? Maybe you've done like me and you visited some national parks around the country. You looked up on the peak of Mount Rainier. Maybe you looked down on the Grand Canyon and watched the Colorado River flow through it. Maybe you've been in Utah and you've seen Arches or Bryce or somewhere like that, and you think, man, this is amazing. We live in an amazing world created by an amazing God. Well, today we're going to pick up in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see an amazing God. We're going to see that God created everything for a purpose. But we need to start with the book of Genesis, like the literal book itself. Like, where does it come from? What's it all about? Well, the book of Genesis was written, we believe, by Moses. Now, Moses wrote the book Genesis, he wrote Exodus, he wrote Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible that we call the Pentateuch, or the book of Moses. He wrote these at a certain time in history, and he probably wrote it during that Exodus period, the period after the people of Israel left Egypt and as they're headed to the Promised Land. He had about 40 years there to write this, so he probably wrote it during that period for those people. Think on that for a second. He wrote it to the Hebrew people, God's people, so that they could understand who God is, who they are in relation to God. Because remember, these people had spent 400 years in slavery in a pagan land to a pagan people. So they probably weren't too up to date and probably didn't really understand really this God that they're following. So Moses wants them to understand who he is. They understand how he wants people to relate to him, and how he wants people to relate to each other. And so that's where all the laws come in and all that. And so Moses is trying to help them be God's people. Moses begins, though, with creation. In the beginning. He begins right there at the beginning to help people understand that God created the world. You see, there were lots of stories and myths around all the other nations they had about how the world came to being, and they had probably learned some of these in Egypt, and they might have believed some of them. But so Moses wanted them to know God created the world, and God created you as a people, Israel, so he's trying to help them see that. The first 11 books of the Bible the first 11 chapters of Genesis kind of deal with how God relates to the whole world. And then in chapter 13 or 12, Moses begins to narrow down. He begins to show them how God relates to Israel and how God relates to his people in particular. But we're going to pick up today in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So check it out with me. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was an evening and a morning one day. Here we see the beginning of all things except God. God exists eternally, but nothing else does. You see, here we see the beginning of matter. We see the beginning of time itself in this verse. God created everything in the beginning. But there's something more to Genesis 1, verse 1 than just the fact that God created. There is a beginning, but a beginning suggests an ending. Now think on this for a second. You go to a basketball game, and you know it's got 4 quarters. And you know that each quarter has a certain number of minutes in it. And so you probably could guess, okay, the game's going to end. There's 4 quarters. It's going to end. There might be overtime, but at some point, we're going home. But you don't exactly know when the end's going to be. Yes, there's a certain number of minutes in each quarter, but you don't really know how long the quarter's really going to last. Because there's going to be a timeout. There's going to be, maybe someone turns their ankle, so you got to stop for a little while to take care of that. There's things that break up the time. And so you don't know when it's going to end, but you know it's going to end. But think about basketball again. It's not just about getting out there and running around and dribbling and shooting into the basket. There's a purpose to all of that. The purpose is for one team to score more points than the other team. So there's a purpose to a basketball game. The same is true about the world. Same is true about God's creation. There's a beginning. There will be an end. We don't know when that's going to be exactly. And there's also a purpose to everything. God just didn't create the world and say, "Oh, look what I did. Isn't that a pretty thing I made?" He created it for a purpose. Look at Isaiah 46:10. "I declare the end from the beginning, and from long ago what is not yet done, saying, My plan will take place, and I will do all my will. God is moving history to a point. He's got a purpose in mind for it. He's taken us to a place that he wants us to be. So God has a purpose, and it's not explicitly stated here in Genesis, and that's why we have the whole Bible. It explains it all to us. But God created it for a purpose. But notice what it says, God created. That word created is interesting. It's a word that the subject is always God. God created. And that word is also interesting because it always refers to what was created, but it never refers to the material used to create. So that should show us a couple things. God created, and God created from nothing. Now, we can't do that. I can make something. I can take some wood, and I can take some metal, and I can form that into different shapes, and I can put that together, and I can make a hammer. But I can't just make a hammer appear. I can't say, let there be hammer, and there is hammer. I can't do that. I can't even say, let there be wood, and let there be metal, and put it together into a hammer. Can't do it. Only God can create from nothing. So I want you to stop and consider for a minute. How does God create the cosmos? He spoke it into being. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God used his words to express his will and make his will come into being. God wanted to create the world, so God said, be, and it was. So God used his words to create. And again, we talked about the fact that I can't create from nothing, but also I can't build like God built. You know, if I want to build a bookshelf, I can take that hammer that I forged earlier, and I can take some nails, and I can take some wood, and I can build a bookshelf. I hammer the nails together, and I build a bookshelf. I use my arms and my body and my hands and my muscles to make a bookshelf. For God to make the world, he says, be. And it is. With a mere utterance, God can create the universe in every way that he wants it to be, down to every atom, positioned the way he wants it to be, created the way he wants it to be, the stars where he wants them to be. God just says, be, and it is. So this brings us to a question for us to stop and ponder for a second. What reaction can believers express in response to God's ability to create the world from nothing with only the spoken word? The reality of God's power and God's omnipotence, meaning he can just speak it into being, that should elicit awe from us. Wonder, amazement at who he is. The fact that he can do that, he can create us and everything, should elicit respect from us, and obedience from us, a devotion from us. But also, it can remind us that it's God's. God created it, it is his. When you were a kid, did you ever borrow something from somebody, or maybe you just had something? Maybe you had a new toy or something like that, and your mom said, treat it like you borrowed it. Now what does that mean? Because I borrow something, I'm going to treat it well. I'm going to return it in good condition. So if I own something and I treat it like I borrowed it, I'm going to treat it well. In this world, we are borrowing everything from God. It is God's. We borrow the resources. We borrow our resources. We borrow our homes. We borrow our church buildings. Everything we have, all the wonders out there belong to God, and we're just using them. We should treat it like we borrowed it because we're really borrowing it. Now look at verses 3 through 5 again. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning one day. Moses tells us that God named light and darkness. This is interesting because it shows us something special. In our day and in the modern day, only owners or parents get to name. Think on that. If I make something, I create something new. It's a brand new invention. It's mine. I name it because it's mine. You name your children because they're yours. Someone else doesn't come in and say the state of whatever has declared the church child's name will be Elizabeth. No, it doesn't happen that way. We name our children. And so God is demonstrating his sovereignty, the fact that he owns creation, that he made it by naming creation. He names these things because they're his. But it's also interesting to see that God declares it good. Repeatedly throughout the creation account, we see that God declares it good. Everything he made was good because nothing resists the shaping of God. Nothing resists, nothing's partially done. He didn't get halfway up Everest and stop and say, that's tall enough. He didn't get halfway down the ocean and say, that's deep enough. He created everything completely and complete, and it was good. See, Moses begins here showing us that God created light and darkness. And then he goes on throughout chapter 1 showing how God created everything else. He created the land. He created the sky. He created the birds to fill the sky. He created the animals to fill the land, the sea animals, the fish and stuff to fill the seas. And God created all these things. And he gets down to the last day of creation, day 6, and there's one final thing to create. And let's look and see what that is. Look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 31. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creation that crawls on the earth. God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seeds. This will be food for you, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it. I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the 6th day. Earlier, I mentioned the wonders of this world, the great things you can see in nature, the mountains, the rivers, the deserts even, they're amazing. And we look at those and we go, man, God is amazing. We stand in awe at what God has done. Maybe you've seen images of the Hubble telescope, images from the James Webb Space Telescope, and you see these far and distant galaxies, and they're amazing. It's incredible what God has done. And we're seeing things now that God created that no one's ever seen. God just created them because God wanted them to be. And we look at those and we go, man, God is wonderful. God is amazing. We stand in awe at what he's done. All of that was created in days 1 through 5. God created all of that. And on day 6, God reserved that for the pinnacle of his creation, humanity. God created them, and it is the creation of humanity is the most awe-inspiring thing we can look at in creation. Not because I'm amazing, not because you're amazing, but because God created man to have a relationship with him on that day. That's all he did that day, humanity. Look at Psalm 8, verses 3 through 8. The psalmist writes, when I observe your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which are set in place, what is a human being that you remember him? A son of man that you look after him? You made him a little less than God and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all the sheep and the oxen, as well as the animals in the wild, the birds of the sky, and the fish of the sea that pass through the currents of the seas. Like the psalmist, we can look at ourselves and we can look at the world around us and go, why did God do that? Why did God create us a little less than God and crown us with glory? Why did he do that? It's because God wanted to. That's what God's will was. But not only did God create man, God personally, physically created humanity. Look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Then the Lord formed man out of the dust from the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. We're going to talk more about this next week, but we see here that God formed man, breathed life into him. The sky, the sun, the animals, everything else, God said, let it be, and it was. But God formed man. One way for us to understand this, what this really means for us, to understand the idea of the image of God. We are created in the image of God. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to rely on the Explore the Bible commentary here, and I'm going to talk about three impacts that has on us, 3 things that means for us. First, mankind mirrors God in his characteristics. Mankind has the ability to reason, to communicate, to be creative, to exist in relationship with others. These are some characteristics of God, and we mirror those characteristics. But not only that, but we are also become hearers of God. And what do I mean by that? It means that we can have a relationship with God like nothing else can. We can hear from him. We can speak to him. And because of that, we are spiritual. We are responsible. We're responsible to be moral. We're responsible to God in different ways because we mirror his characteristics. But also, we represent God in his character. Humans can be loving, patient, forgiving, kind, and faithful. These are characteristics of God. These are things that God does, and we can mirror those things. But lastly, mankind reflects God's glory through dominion and ruling. Humans are rulers and sons. We are God's royal representative on earth. We're his vice regent, tasked with working and tending and caring for his creation. But also, there's a familial aspect to this, a parental aspect to this. We are God's sons. We are God's daughters. He created us. And as a response to that, we can have a relationship with him. We can be in a relationship with him like nothing else can. No animals can have a relationship with God like we can. Only we can do that. So God, we mirror God in these different ways. We reflect God in these different ways. So let's stop and let's ponder again. How might the reality of being image bearers affect the way humans think, feel, and act? As image bearers and believers in particular, we should strive to represent the Lord well. We do this through our spiritual connection with him. We do this through practicing his character traits with those around us. And we do this also through stewarding his creation. We're to take care of it. As the most authoritative, powerful beings on the planet, we have a great responsibility. And God created us in his image to fulfill that responsibility. But this also can remind us of another thing. Not only are we tasked with these things, but we know for a fact that this didn't last in its perfect way that God intended it to last. You see, Adam and Eve sinned. And we know that sin marred the image of God in us. I don't think it destroyed the image of God in us, but there's a scar on that image. And we know that only through the promise of Jesus, the promise of the gospel, and the promise that Jesus makes about the end of all things, only then will we return to the state that we were originally created in as the true, full-fledged image bearers of God. See, our image is marred. And that's why the gospel is so important. That's why salvation is so important, because it begins moving us back to what God intended us to be. God ends this passage with a blessing. He blesses them. He says, go forth, multiply, fill the earth, have dominion over it. And that's going to be fleshed out more in Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham. But we see here that God's created everything. He's done. He's created all the nature and all the cosmos. He's created man. He's done all that. But there's one day left in the creation account. It's day 7. Let's look and see what that has to teach us. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. Moses tells us that everything that needed to be created was created. It was done. God's will for creation had been completed. God was finished. There's no more creation that needed to be made. Now, God continues to create through procreation and creating new humans and souls and things like that, but the creation event had happened. And then he tells us that he rested. Now, what does that mean? Why does God need to rest? God's omnipotent. What's going on here? Well, God didn't rest out of fatigue. God wasn't worn out. God rested because he was done. There was nothing else to create. He looked around and said, done. I guess I'll not create today. He rested. He was finished creating. I want to take a moment. I want you to think about something. How can God's omnipotence, his being all-powerful, bring peace and feelings of security to those who follow him. Now, while Genesis tells us God stopped creating, God didn't stop doing things. God still governs the world through his providence. God is still working to bring things about in the future. God still cares for us as individuals. And the fact that God can do all of that, create and still work and accomplish things, that should bring peace in our lives. God can handle whatever comes our way. God can handle whatever situation comes up in the world. He is all-powerful, and that can give us peace and security. And we can know that no matter what, he's got us. Go back and look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 again. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work. Moses tells us that God blessed the day. Now that's interesting. You see, there's been two other blessings in the creation account. He blessed the animals and he blessed humanity. He blessed them so they could reproduce. They could fill the earth. They could be fruitful. God blesses the day so that it will be spiritually fruitful for humanity. It's a day to rest, a day that's set aside for us. God's providing an example for us, saying, you need to stop. You need to take some time and rest. But we rest not only from our labors, we rest in him. We are rejuvenated in him when we rest in him. And we take time and think about him as creator. We take time to think about him as redeemer. When Moses institutes the Sabbath day, later in the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus and Leviticus and all those, he's showing the people, you need to stop and memorialize what God has done and worship him as creator of everything and the redeemer of Israel. And we can think on that as our redeemer of our personal selves. But this causes us to ask a question as modern believers. What does this have to do with us? How do we relate to the Sabbath? Well, go to Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food or drink, or in the matter of a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is Christ. With the birth of the church, the early believers set apart the first day of the week as the day that we worship the Lord, because that's the day the Lord was raised. And so we don't really have the Sabbath like the Jews had it. And actually, Paul tells us, don't let these religious things of Israel mark you. Circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath laws, those don't mark the believer. But that doesn't negate the need to rest. We still need to find time to unwind because we're humans. We get tired. We get worn out both physically, emotionally, and mentally. We need to find time to stop and rest. But again, this might cause the church member to ask a question. Well, what about Sundays? Sundays, what? Shouldn't I be resting on Sundays? Well, Sundays we come together and we worship corporately and we study the Bible together in smaller groups possibly. And so we celebrate on Sunday the resurrection of Jesus and what it means for us. And sometimes all the stuff that comes along with church life seems like it gets in the way of our rest. If you go to many churches in this country, you've got meetings on Sunday. You've got Bible study at night, and it gets in the way of your rest. And I get that. And I'm not saying don't rest, but I'm saying we should be thoughtful about what the church is. The church is, yes, everybody who believes in Jesus, and we do exist around the world, but I'm talking about the local church. What is it? It is a place that we come together and worship, a place we come together and study, but it is also an organization created to fulfill the Great Commission. And an organization must be administered well and proactively. So Sundays are a day of rest, they're a day of worship, they're a day of study, but they're also a day of ministry work. Now, I'm not saying tire yourself out and get frustrated and all this because of Sundays or a lot of stuff going on. I'm just saying just be aware that sometimes we've got to do church work on Sundays because we've got to get stuff done. And so I want to encourage you, rest. Find times on the weekends, find times on Sunday afternoons, find times to decompress because God said you needed to. God said we need to rest. And I'm giving you a picture of that. God's created everything, and he created good, and he created humans, and he blessed them and created them in God's image so that they can represent him. And then God showed us how to rest. You see, this creation account isn't just something for us to look back on and say, oh, God did that. That's how it happened. It has implications for us. So I want to challenge you, though, this week. I'm going to give you kind of like a homework project to do this week. You can find this in your Explorer Bible curriculum if you've got it. But I want you to spend time this week thinking about other Bible passages. I want you to gain a deeper insight into creation's story. Spend time reading and meditating on other passages in Scripture that speak of God's creative activities in the beginning. Begin by understanding creation as an act of God's will, and you can read those verses there. Look next at the pinnacle of creation and read those verses and think on those verses. Study the agent of creation himself, and then spend time worshiping by reading Psalm 104 and Psalm 136, 1 through 9. It's a little project for you this week to spend time in God's Word. And be reminded that God is creator. God created it all for a purpose. God created you to represent Him in the world. And remember, God created us to take some time to rest in Him so that we can do the work He has us to do to reach the nations with the gospel. I'll see you next week.